When the original North American Treaty Organization was created, only the Augustus Manquet de Gaulle got the point of what we were doing. He took France out of our Cosa Nostra and developed his own atomic bomb. But France was still very much linked to the Imperium, through the CIA and other secret forces. Political control was exerted within the empire, not only driving the Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson around a bend too far, but preventing Italy from ever having a cohesive government by not allowing the historic compromise, a government of Christian Democrats and communists. The Soviet, always reactive, promptly cracked down on their client states, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, East Germany, and a wall went up in Berlin to spite their face, not ours. From 1950 to 1990, Europe was dangerously divided and armed to the teeth. But as American producers of weapons were never richer, all was well with their world. At Yalta, Roosevelt wanted to break up the European colonial empires, particularly that of the French. Of Indochina, FDR said, France has milked it for 100 years. For the time being, he proposed a UN trusteeship. Then he died. Unlike Roosevelt, Truman was not a philatelist. Had he been a stamp collector, he might have known where the various countries in the world were and who lived in them. Like every good American, he knew he hated communism. He also hated socialism, which may or may not have been the same thing. No one was ever quite sure. Yet as early as the American election of 1848, socialism, imported by comical German immigrants with noses always in books, was an omnious specter, calculated to enrage a raw capitalist society with labor unions, health care, and other devil's work, still being fiercely resisted a century and a half later. In 1946, when Ho Chi Minh asked the United States to take Indochina under its wing, Truman said, "No way, you're some kind of Fu Manchu communist, the worst." In August 1945, Truman told de Gaulle that the French could return to Indochina. We were no longer FDR anti-imperialists. As Ho had his Northern Republic, the French installed Bao Dai in the south. February 1st, 1950, the State Department, of all places, came to this extraordinary conclusion. This is their report. The choice confronting the United States is to support the French in Indochina or face the extension of communism over the remainder of the continental area of Southeast Asia and possibly further westward. Thus, without shepherds or even a napalm star, the domino theory was born in a humble State Department manger. On May 8, 1950, Acheson recommended economic and military aid to the French in Vietnam. By 1955, the U.S. was paying 40% of the French cost of that war. For a quarter century, the United States was to fight in Vietnam because our ignorant leaders and their sharp-eyed financiers never realized that the game is not dominoes, but chess. Happily, nothing ever stays the same. During the last days of the waning moon, a haphazard Western European economic union has been cobbled together. Then, as the Soviet, demonstrating its pure viciousness, abruptly folded, the two Germanys, leaving us high and dry and petulant, the two Germanys that we had so painstakingly kept apart reunited. Washington was suddenly adrift, and in the sky the moon of empire paused. Neither Reagan nor Bush had much knowledge of history or geography. Nevertheless, orders still kept coming from the White House, but they were less and less heeded because everyone knew that the Oval One had a bank overdraft of $5 trillion, and he could no longer give presents to good clients or wage war without first passing the hat to the Germans and the Japanese, as he was obliged to do when Ted Turner had his light show for CNN in the Persian Gulf. Gradually, it is now becoming evident to even the most distracted funster that there is no longer any need for NATO because there is no enemy. One might say there never really was one, even when NATO was started. But over the years, we did succeed in creating a pretty dangerous Soviet, a funhouse mirror version of ourselves. Although the United States may yet, in support of Israel, declare war on 1 billion Muslims, the Europeans will stay out of that one. They recall 1529 when Turks besieged Vienna, not as obliging guest workers, but as world conquerors. Never again. The time has now come for the Europeans to free themselves of their American masters. Our motive for hanging on to empire is obvious. With an expanded NATO, our arms makers, if not workers, are in for a bonanza. As it is, American sale of weapons went up 23% last year, while restrictions on sales to Latin America are being lifted. Chile, ever menaced by Ecuador, plans to buy 24 F-16 jet fighters. But it is an expanded NATO that causes true joy in the boardrooms. Upon joining NATO, the lucky new club member is obliged to buy expensive weapons from the likes of Lockheed Martin, recently merged with Northrop Grumman. Since the new members have precarious economies and the old ones are not exactly booming, the American taxpayer, a wan goose that lays few eggs, will have to borrow even more money to foot the bill, which the Congressional Budget Office says should come to $125 billion over 15 years, with the U.S. paying most of it. Yeltsin correctly sees this as a hostile move against Russia, not to mention an expensive renewal of the Cold War. There comes a moment when empires cease to exert energy and become symbolic or existential, as we used to say back in the 40s. The current wrangling over NATO demonstrates what a quandary a symbolic empire is in when it wants to maintain its view of itself at home and abroad, and yet lacks the mind, much less the resources, to impose its hegemony upon its former client states. Happily, in the absence of money and common will, nothing much will probably happen. Meanwhile, there's a new and better world ready to be born. The optimum economic unit in the world is now the city-state. Thanks to technology, everyone knows or can know something about everyone else on the planet. The message now pounding in over the internet is the irrelevancy, not to mention the sheer danger of the traditional nation-state, much less empire. Currently, the warlord bankers at Peking are tolerating not only vigorous semi-autonomies like Shanghai, but they are enjoying Hong Kong for the present. We may not like the way Singapore is run, though we seem to be imitating their politics by suing in the courts our political enemies, thus breaking them. But it is, relatively speaking, a greater commercial success, perhaps even than the United States. In the next century, barring accident, the common euro market will evolve not so much into a union of ancient blood-stained states as a mosaic of homogeneous regions like the Spanish-French Basques, or city-states like Milan, each loosely linked in trade with a clearinghouse information center at Brussels. They would orchestrate finance and trade and the policing of cartels. Basques, Bretons, Walloons, Scots, who want to be rid of onerous nation-states, should be let to go in order to pursue and even, why not, overtake happiness, the goal, or so we Americans have always pretended to believe, of the human enterprise. So on that predictably sententious American note, I am tempted to enjoin the movers and shakers of this world to recall the Greek doctor's oath, above all, do no harm. Hippocrates also wrote, and this goes for the moved and the shaken of the world, life is short, but the art is long, the opportunity fleeting, the experiment perilous, the judgment difficult.
Thank you. If Stalin were as benign as you say, then did the Gulag not exist? Were there no purges? Was the Berlin Wall simply decorative landscaping? What about East Germany in 1953, Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968? Tell us what was going on there.
I thought I just did. Never excuse your own faults by pointing to other people's. That he was a thug in regard to his own people and to the client states, that driven by fear of us, he treated badly and occupied. What I'm making the point here is the initiative was taken by us. He wanted to regularize relations with the United States, and he thought he had done it with Roosevelt. Truman, who missed the point of everything, guided by Jimmy Burns, that great cosmic thinker, managed to make every mistake in the book and to terrify Stalin. He was frightened. So he did his best he reacted always to what we did. The fact that Stalin treated his own people very, very badly is, I'm afraid, a Russian problem and not ours. We are not in the business of correcting all the governments on earth. We can't do our own, so why should we do Russia's for them? So I think it's fairly clear I'm saying what happened, that we had this terrible 40 years.
Your cousin, Vice President Al Gore, has been a willing, even eager advocate of the national security state for many years. What do you think?
Well, my cousin and I have plausible deniability about each other. There are days when I don't acknowledge his existence and days when he doesn't certainly acknowledge mine. He is a perfectly standard Southern Defense Department senator in the Senate. And now all I do, I watch him standing behind Clinton, and his eyes are beginning to sparkle. For a long time they looked rather dull. And if you notice him, there are times when, I worry about Clinton because Albert is getting closer and closer. He's going to bite one day. He just has a vampire look in his eye, and suddenly there'll be a new administration right on camera. I don't think that administration will be any different from Herbert Hoover, Harry Truman, you name it, Grover Cleveland. No, Grover Cleveland was pretty good about labor unions.
Speaking as a morally liberated Washington blueblood, what is the most serious breach of ethics committed in politics today? Are there ethics in politics anymore, assuming there ever were?
Well, the most visible change in my lifetime, and the lifetime of most people here, has been the money that is spent on campaigns, which is now obscene. And the Congress went through a very pretty dance, didn't they, over the campaign contributions. There was a lot of passion and heat in that debate. Well, the system will never change because they're paid for by corporations. I mean, it's like asking the burglar as he reaches the second floor to kick away his ladder. He is not going to do that ever. If I were optimistic, I would propose civil war, but I'm not going to.